Let him go, or you'll have to deal with me. I wasn't going to tell this story, but after what I witnessed, I couldn't stay quiet. A 3-year-old girl, barely tall enough to reach a doorknob, stood between a group of dangerous men and a billionaire they were about to drag away. She looked up at them with those tiny eyes, crossed her arms, and said 7 words that made every single person in that room freeze. Nobody laughed. Nobody moved. And I promise you, by the end of this story, you will never look at a child the same way again. Welcome back, beautiful souls, to this channel, the place where real emotions meet real stories that remind us why humanity is still worth believing in. If this is your first time here, we are so glad you found us today, because this story is something else entirely. Before we dive in, drop a comment right now and tell me where you are watching from and which country you belong to. I read every single one, and I love knowing who's in this community with me. What you're about to hear is one of the most emotional, jaw-dropping, and deeply heartwarming stories I have ever come across. It involves betrayal from the highest places, love from the most unexpected source, and a twist so powerful it brought an entire room of adults to tears. Stay with me until the very end, because this story builds, and it builds beautifully. Let's begin. Nobody in that mansion ever imagined that the smallest person in the building would be the one to save it all. The Thorne estate sat on the edge of Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, one of those grand old properties that looked like it had been built by someone who wanted the whole world to know exactly how much money they had. Marble columns, iron gates, a circular driveway lined with imported oak trees, and inside, every room told a story of wealth so deep it had its own echo. Julian Thorne was in his early 40s, self-made, and the kind of man who had earned every single dollar through long days, cold coffee, and a stubbornness that his late mother used to call the family curse. He had built his empire from a small tech startup in a Chicago basement to a billion-dollar logistics company that moved half the medical supplies in the Midwest. People admired him, some feared him, very few actually knew him. But the people who worked inside his estate, the cooks, the groundskeepers, the housekeeping staff, they knew a different Julian. They knew the man who left extra bonuses in envelopes during the holidays without signing his name. The man who once quietly paid for his head chef's mother's cancer treatment and told the chef it was an estate expense. The man who, when nobody was watching, was actually kind. Among his household staff was a woman named Elena Vargas. Elena had been working at the Thorne estate for several years. She was quiet, hard-working, and deeply loyal. The kind of employee who showed up early every single day and never left until the work was done right. She was a single mother, and she brought her daughter Lila to work with her on days when the babysitter fell through. Lila was 3 years old. She had big brown eyes, 2 lopsided pigtails that Elena could never quite make symmetrical, and a personality roughly the size of a thunderstorm. She called Julian Mr. Mark because she couldn't pronounce Thorne, and Julian, who had never particularly considered himself a child person, had somehow ended up completely charmed by her. He kept a small basket of crayons in his home office because Lila had once sat under his desk and drawn on a legal pad for hours while he was on a call, and he hadn't had the heart to stop her. That was the world inside the estate. Warm, quiet, surprisingly human for a place so grand. But outside those iron gates, a different kind of story was taking shape. Julian had recently gotten engaged. Her name was Serena Langford. On the surface, she was everything a man like Julian was supposed to want. Beautiful, educated, socially polished, from a well-connected East Coast family. Their engagement had been announced at a charity gala several months ago, and the photos had made it into half a dozen lifestyle magazines. But Elena had a feeling she couldn't shake. It had started small. A tone in Serena's voice when she spoke to the staff. Not rude exactly, but cold in a way that felt deliberate. The way she walked through rooms like she was calculating their future value. The phone calls she took outside, always outside. Voice dropped low whenever Elena happened to be nearby. And once, just once, Elena had turned a corner in the east hallway and seen Serena standing at Julian's private safe with her hand pressed flat against the door, eyes closed like she was listening to it. Elena had said nothing. She was the maid. It wasn't her place. But she watched, and she worried. Tell me, have you ever had a feeling about someone that you just couldn't explain, but deep down you knew something wasn't right? Let me know in the comments. The estate was preparing for a large private dinner one evening, a business gathering Julian hosted every quarter for his senior partners and investors. The staff was buzzing. The kitchen had been running since dawn. Elena had brought Lila that day because her babysitter had called in sick. And Lila sat in the small staff break room off the kitchen, coloring a picture of what she called a princess horse, while the world moved busily around her. None of them, not Elena, not Julian, not even Serena, knew what that night was about to become. Secrets have a weight to them, and that night, the Thorne estate was about to buckle under the pressure of one it never saw coming. The dinner went beautifully on the surface. A dozen guests, 3 courses, the kind of polished, effortless evening that takes an army of staff and military-level planning to execute. Julian moved through the room the way he always did at these events, confident, measured, warm without being soft. He shook hands, remembered names, made each guest feel like the most important person in the building. Serena sat at the far end of the table, radiant in a deep burgundy gown, playing the role of gracious hostess with such precision that watching her felt like watching a performance. She laughed at the right moments, touched Julian's arm at the right moments, raised her glass at the right moments. Elena, refilling water glasses along the far wall, watched her. The guests began leaving later that evening. Soon after, the estate had grown quiet. The kitchen staff finished cleanup and headed home. The groundskeeper locked the east gate. Julian walked his last 2 guests to the door, said his goodbyes, and turned back toward the house. Elena was gathering the final linens from the dining room. Lila had fallen asleep on the small sofa in the break room, her crayon still loosely held in one little fist. The princess horse finished and propped against the cushion beside her. That's when Elena heard the voices, low, real, more than one, coming from the direction of Julian's private study. She told herself it was probably 2 of his business associates who had stayed behind. It wasn't unusual. She kept working, but something made her slow down. The voices had a different quality to them, clipped, intentional, tense in a way that business conversation rarely was. And then she heard something that stopped her completely. A sound she hadn't heard in all her years of working in this house. Julian Thorne raised his voice. Elena set down the linen basket. She moved quietly to the hallway. The study door was cracked open. Not wide, but enough. She pressed close to the wall and listened. There were 3 of them. 3 men she had never seen before. And they had clearly come in through the private side entrance, the one only a small number of people knew about. One of them was large, with arms that stretched the seams of his jacket. One was lean, with a shaved head, and the kind of flat, patient eyes that made Elena's stomach turn. The third stood slightly apart, holding a phone. They weren't asking Julian anything. They were telling him. He was going to sign over a controlling share of his company's transport licensing contracts tonight. Or he was going to take a very unpleasant ride and sign them somewhere far less comfortable. Julian stood behind his desk, steady. He was afraid. Elena could see that, but he was holding it. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly. "The only mistake in this room," the lean one said, "was trusting the wrong person for years." And then the man with the phone turned the screen around. It was a photo. A smiling photo of Serena and the lean man, laughing together at what looked like a restaurant, dated over a year earlier. Long before the engagement, long before the gala. Elena felt the world tilt. What would you do if you discovered that the person closest to you had been working against you the entire time? Think about that for a moment. Serena hadn't just chosen Julian. She had been placed there. A long game. A calculated, patient, ruthless infiltration of everything Julian had built, designed to dismantle it from the inside out. Elena's hands were shaking. She needed to call someone. She needed to get to her phone. She took one silent step backward, and her foot caught the edge of the linen basket she had set on the floor. It didn't fall loudly, just a soft scrape against the hardwood. but the large man's head turned immediately toward the hallway. Elena pressed flat against the wall. She didn't breathe. And then she heard the softest sound in the world. Tiny footsteps. Nobody plans for a 3-year-old to be the bravest person in the room. But sometimes, the smallest hearts carry the most courage. Lila had woken up. Elena didn't know if it was instinct or just the randomness of a toddler's sleep schedule, but somehow that tiny girl had slipped off the break room sofa, padded barefoot down the hallway in her little pink pajamas, the ones with the yellow stars, and found her mother pressed against a wall outside a room full of dangerous men. She looked up at Elena with sleepy eyes and whispered, "Mama." Elena's heart stopped. She crouched immediately, hands on Lila's shoulders, shaking her head desperately. "Quiet, baby, please, quiet." But it was too late. The study door swung open. The large man filled the doorframe. He looked down at Elena crouching on the floor, looked at Lila, then looked back at Elena with an expression that made it very clear that complications were not part of the plan for tonight. "Get her out of here," the lean one called from inside. The large man reached out to grab Elena's arm, and that's when it happened. Lila stepped forward. One small step, then another, until she was standing directly between the large man and her mother, looking straight up at him. This enormous man who could have moved her aside with one hand. And she crossed her arms across her little chest. Her voice was small. It wobbled slightly, but every single word was clear. "Let him go, or you'll have to deal with me." She had misunderstood. She thought they were going to hurt her mother, not Julian. She had heard voices, felt something wrong, and her 3-year-old brain had produced the most powerful thing it knew. Protection. She was protecting her mama. The large man stared at her. Inside the room, in the study, the lean one had gone quiet. Julian, from behind his desk, had turned. And for one suspended, unreal moment, every person in that hallway and room was completely still. Then something happened that nobody predicted. The large man, this hired, hardened man who had clearly spent years becoming someone who felt nothing, looked at that tiny girl with her crossed arms and her star pajamas and her wobbling, brave voice, and something moved across his face. Elena would later say it looked like grief, like something long buried suddenly remembering itself. He took a step back. "I'm not doing this," he said. His voice was flat, but something underneath it had cracked. The lean one's eyes snapped to him. "What?" "I said I'm not doing this." He turned around. "Not with a kid here. I'm done." Do you believe that sometimes the most innocent people carry the most power? Not because of strength, but because of what they remind us of. Tell me what you think. What happened next moved fast. The lean one made a grab for Julian. Julian, who had been quietly calculating his options for the last 20 minutes, was ready. He threw his weight sideways, caught the edge of the desk, and hit the emergency security button hidden beneath the lip of the drawer. Silent alarm. Direct line to a private security firm he had hired after a threat a couple of years earlier that the police had told him was probably nothing. The third man, the one with the phone, bolted immediately. The lean one, realizing the momentum of the evening had collapsed entirely, followed. The large man was already gone. Within minutes, 2 vehicles from the private security company were at the estate gates. Shortly after, local police arrived. Within the hour, the lean man and the third man had been found nearby. Elena sat on the hallway floor with Lila in her lap, rocking her slowly, tears running down her face that she hadn't even noticed starting. Julian walked out of the study. He looked at Elena. He looked at Lila. Lila looked up at him with her big brown eyes and said perfectly calmly, "Mr. Mark, I was brave." Julian Thorne, self-made man, person who had never once cried at a press conference or a board meeting or even at his mother's funeral because he had held himself together with both hands, sat down on the hallway floor across from a 3-year-old and completely fell apart. The truth, once it started unraveling, didn't stop. And what it revealed changed everything Julian thought he knew about his life. The investigation moved quickly. Serena was taken into custody for questioning the following morning. She had left the estate after dinner. "Gone home," she said, tired from the evening. But her phone records told a different story. Multiple calls to a number linked to the lean man over the previous weeks. A wire transfer from an account connected to her family trust to a shell company registered in Delaware. A meeting at a hotel in downtown Milwaukee days earlier. The plan had been in the making for many months. Serena had been recruited by a competitor of Julian's, a man named Victor Lang, who had lost a major federal contract to Thorne Logistics years earlier and had never forgiven it. Victor Lang had identified Serena at a fundraiser, recognized her ambition and her financial pressures. Her family's fortune was far smaller than it appeared and had offered her a partnership. Get close to Julian, learn the access points to his licensing contracts, deliver them. She had done everything right for many months, except she hadn't counted on a maid working late or a 3-year-old who woke up from a nap. Julian sat in his kitchen in the middle of the night while detectives moved through his study, and he stared at the table. Elena brought him coffee without being asked and sat across from him because she decided in that moment that her job title did not cover situations like this. And what he needed was not an employee, it was a person. "I should have seen it," Julian said quietly. "People who are trying to deceive you get very good at being unseeable," Elena said. He looked at her. "How long did you have a feeling?" She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "A while." "Why didn't you say something?" "Because I'm the maid, Mr. Thorne. People don't usually want to hear that from me." Something crossed his face that looked like shame. "Have you ever stayed quiet about something important because you were afraid people wouldn't take you seriously because of who you are or what you do?" I think more of us have been there than we admit. Lila had been put to bed in one of the guest rooms, the first time she had ever slept in a room with actual curtains. She had informed Elena very seriously before closing her eyes. The following weeks brought lawyers and depositions and headlines. Julian did everything he could to keep things controlled. Victor Lang was arrested. Serena cooperated with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced charge. The lean man and the third man were held. The large man, whose name turned out to be Thomas Reed, had walked into a police station the morning after the incident and turned himself in. In his statement, he said he had been hired for the job weeks earlier, that he had not known a child would be present, and that when he saw her, when she stepped forward with her arms crossed and that little voice, he had thought of his own daughter, whom he hadn't seen in years, because of choices not unlike the ones he'd been making his whole life. He said the little girl reminded him that he had once been someone who would not have walked into that room. The prosecutor's office, noting his immediate cooperation and surrender, reduced his charges. He served several months and was released. He later wrote a letter addressed to the little girl in the star pajamas that Elena read and folded carefully and placed in a box to give to Lila when she was old enough to understand it. Back at the estate, Julian made several decisions. He restructured his household staff contracts, providing full health care benefits and a pension plan to all long-term employees, something he admitted he should have done years ago. He established a college fund in Lila's name, not large enough to be dramatic, large enough to matter. And he called Elena into his office one morning and offered her a position he created specifically because he realized he had been operating without one. Director of Household Operations, a real title, a real salary, a real seat at the table for the person who, in more ways than one, had kept his house standing. Elena cried. He tried not to. She cried anyway. The ending of this story isn't just about what was saved that night. It's about what was found. In the months that followed, the Thorne estate felt different. Not in its bones. The marble columns were still there, the iron gates, the circular driveway with its imported oaks, but in its atmosphere. The way you feel a house differently when the tension has finally left it. Julian had not rushed back into anything resembling a romantic relationship. He was quieter now, more deliberate. He had started taking his Sunday mornings off, something he had not done in many years, and he spent them in the kitchen, which he had previously treated as a room he occasionally walked through on the way to somewhere else. Now he made coffee badly and read actual books, and sometimes, when Lila was at the estate, let her critique his scrambled eggs with the authority of someone who had very strong opinions about scrambled eggs. Elena had settled into her new role with the same quiet competence she had brought to every role before it. She organized. She led. She anticipated. The staff respected her. Julian respected her in a way that was visible and consistent, and something she had to quietly get used to, because she had spent a long time operating in spaces where her presence was expected, but her value was not. One afternoon, Julian found Lila in his study again, sitting under his desk with a crayon basket. She was drawing what she described as "The Night the Bad Men Came," which turned out to be a series of colorful shapes that Elena privately thought looked like abstract expressionism, and Lila privately felt were very accurate. "Can I ask you something?" Julian said, sitting down on the floor beside her. "Yes," said Lila, not looking up from her drawing. "That night, when you stood up to that big man, were you scared?" Lila thought about this for a moment with the full seriousness of a 3-year-old encountering a genuinely complex question. "Yes," she said, "but you did it anyway." "Mama was there," she said simply, "so I had to." Julian was quiet for a long time. "That's the bravest thing I've ever heard," he finally said. Lila handed him a crayon. "Blue, you can help color the horse." And Julian Thorne, who had built a billion-dollar company, who had survived betrayal and threat, and the dismantling of everything he thought he knew, took the blue crayon, sat on the floor of his own study, and colored a horse with a 3-year-old girl in star pajamas. What would you do if you were in Julian's place? If the smallest, most unexpected person turned out to be the one who changed your life? I'd genuinely love to know. Elena stood in the doorway for a moment. She didn't announce herself. She just watched. This man. This child. This quiet afternoon that looked nothing like the night that had preceded it by months. And she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She felt that things, against all probability, had turned out exactly the way they were supposed to. There is a lesson in this story that I want you to carry with you. Courage is not reserved for the strong. It is not reserved for the wealthy, the powerful, the trained, or the prepared. Sometimes, courage shows up in star pajamas on a quiet night with a crayon still in its hand. And it steps forward, not because it isn't afraid, but because someone it loves is standing behind it. And kindness, real, consistent, quiet kindness, never goes unnoticed. Elena spent several years doing her job with integrity in a world that often decided she wasn't worth paying close attention to. But she was always paying attention. And when it mattered most, everything she had quietly invested in that household came back in the most extraordinary way. The world is full of people who are underestimated. Look around you at the people who show up quietly, who protect without announcement, who love without condition. Look closer. You might be surprised by what you find. If this story moved you, if even one part of it stayed with you, please give it a like right now. It takes 1 second, and it means everything to this channel. Subscribe if you're new here, because we tell stories like this every week. Stories that remind you why people, at their core, are still worth believing in. Drop a comment and tell me which moment hit you the hardest. Was it Lila stepping forward? Elena finally being seen? Or Thomas Reed walking into that police station? I want to know. Please share this story with someone who needs to hear it today. Someone who feels unseen. Someone who needs to be reminded that small people can do enormous things. Until next time, take care of each other.